What if the greatest financial empires in history were not built by strength, but by secrets so subtle that most people never realized they were being controlled at all? This is the kind of question that forces us to confront a truth often ignored in mainstream economic stories. Long before names like Carnegie or Rockefeller shaped the global stage, another lineage operated in the shadows, mastering financial influence through invisible tricks that shifted markets, redirected wealth, and quietly rewrote the rules of economic power. When we trace these early patterns, we uncover a world where information was currency, manipulation was strategy, and control was achieved without anyone noticing the strings being pulled. Imagine a marketplace where every rise and fall, every shortage and abundance was not a coincidence, but the result of a carefully crafted plan. These families understood something crucial. Markets are not driven only by supply and demand, but by perception, timing, and psychological pressure. They learned how to predict behaviors, distort expectations, and influence entire regions without ever stepping onto a public stage. This quiet domination created a financial ecosystem where a single whispered rumor or delayed shipment could tilt the balance of power. These hidden architects moved pieces while the world applauded visible leaders, unaware of the silent players designing the foundation of global wealth. As we explore how these invisible mechanisms were created, it becomes clear that the patterns they established still echo through modern finance. You may even recognize moments where you felt markets shift without explanation, or news that sounded too perfectly timed to be accidental. Have you ever felt that economic events sometimes unfold with suspicious precision, or that certain crises benefit the same groups over and over again? You are not alone in that thought, and what you will uncover from here may reshape the way you interpret financial history. Before we continue deeper into these concealed strategies, tell me what this opening made you think of. Have you ever noticed a moment in the economy that felt orchestrated rather than natural? Leave a comment sharing your experience. Make sure to like this video and check whether you are already subscribed to the channel, because understanding these hidden dynamics is essential to recognize how power truly operates. And as we move forward through this story, the next layer reveals even more subtle forces at play, keeping the narrative open for what unfolds next. The earliest forms of financial manipulation did not look like fraud in the way we imagine today. They were subtle adjustments, carefully engineered distortions that shaped the flow of wealth long before official banks or regulatory systems existed. Those early families understood that every economy depends on trust, and trust can be influenced, redirected, or quietly weakened. Instead of openly forcing markets to bend, they learned to interfere with the invisible elements that guided economic life. They discovered that by controlling information, influencing scarcity, or altering the perception of value, they could create predictable reactions across entire regions. What appeared to be natural fluctuations were often deliberate choices made behind closed doors. One of the most effective techniques involved manipulating expectations. Merchants and traders reacted as much to rumors and predictions as they did to real numbers. When whispers about an incoming shortage were strategically planted, prices rose on their own, without a single coin exchanged by those who initiated the rumor. When talk of an abundant harvest spread, markets relaxed, credit expanded, and loans became easier to secure. These families used influence networks that extended through messengers, clerks, record keepers, and travelers, ensuring that key information arrived exactly where it would spark the desired reaction. They did not need to appear as aggressors. They only needed to guide the emotional pulse of the market. Another layer of manipulation involved the deliberate timing of goods. By delaying shipments or accelerating them at critical moments, they created artificial scarcity or sudden supply surges. This allowed them to buy cheaply when panic took hold and sell at inflated prices when demand spiked. Because trade routes were slow and communication limited, it was nearly impossible for ordinary people to recognize that these disruptions were orchestrated. The patterns became self-sustaining, reinforcing power and elevating certain lineages into positions of influence that would last for generations. The foundation of these early manipulations set a precedent that spread across continents. Over time, these strategies evolved from simple local tricks into sophisticated mechanisms, shaping regional and even global markets. As these methods became more structured, families who mastered them gained political leverage, forming alliances with rulers and financiers who depended on their intelligence and resources. And as each generation refined these techniques, the line between economic influence and economic control became increasingly thin, leading directly into the next stage of hidden financial power, where manipulation turned into something far more coordinated and deliberate, continuing the momentum that had already begun to shape the world. As these early practices matured, the families who mastered them discovered an even more powerful tool: privileged information, not the kind that occasionally leaked, but streams of data gathered intentionally and processed strategically. They positioned themselves at the crossroads of trade, diplomacy, and regional politics, where every shipment, dispute, agreement, or shortage produced insights others could only guess at. While common merchants relied on surface signals of the economy, these families operated with layers of hidden knowledge that allowed them to anticipate market behavior with uncanny precision. It was not luck or intuition. It was systematic intelligence, gathering disguised as ordinary communication and observation. Their networks grew into webs of informants who had no idea they were part of something larger. A simple clerk maintaining grain records, a harbor assistant noting incoming ships, a tax collector reporting regional harvest levels, or even travelers sharing news of unrest or climate changes, all fed into a central understanding controlled by a few. Instead of reacting to economic shifts, these families orchestrated their positions long before events unfolded. They knew when rulers would levy new taxes, when wars might disrupt trade, when crops would fail, and when political tensions could weaken currencies. With this advantage, they could buy assets before they appreciated, withdraw investments before markets collapsed, and influence rulers without seeming to interfere. Over time, this control over information became more valuable than land, metals, or armies. It allowed them to operate almost invisibly, shaping economic behavior while remaining outside the public eye. They intentionally avoided fame or titles, understanding that power hidden is often power protected. Historical records mention wealthy traders, influential lenders, or strategic merchants, but the real architects rarely appeared by name. They instead preferred to place intermediaries in visible roles, creating the illusion of distributed influence while keeping the core decisions within the family circle. This mastery of information also allowed them to manufacture stability or instability at will. They could calm markets by releasing reassuring reports through trusted messengers, or they could ignite fear with carefully planted warnings. What seemed like spontaneous waves of confidence or panic were often reactions to narratives they constructed. The world moved in response to signals no one realized had been engineered. And as their methods grew more subtle, the creation of influence shifted from controlling goods to controlling perception itself, bringing these families into a new realm of economic dominance that would merge seamlessly with the next stage of their expanding reach, where persuasion, strategy, and unseen authority blended into a system that felt natural, even inevitable, to everyone living under its influence. As these hidden families refined their command over information, they developed techniques that allowed them to influence not just perception, but the very mechanics of pricing and trade. Their strategies were no longer isolated interventions. They became systems designed to operate quietly, consistently, and with surprising precision. One of the most effective methods relied on adjusting the flow of goods at moments when markets were emotionally vulnerable. When traders reacted to fear or optimism, even small disruptions created amplified effects. A single delayed caravan, a shipment stored slightly longer than necessary, or a fleet redirected to a different port could shift entire sectors without leaving any visible trace of manipulation. They also learned to exploit the psychological rhythm of commerce. Markets tend to move in cycles of anticipation and release, where expectations create momentum even before events occur. By understanding these rhythms, they could inject subtle signals that nudged merchants towards specific decisions. A strategically placed message hinting at political tension could trigger precautionary buying. A quiet rumor about stable harvests could ease anxieties and lower prices. Each manipulation looked natural because it aligned with the emotional tendencies already present in economic life. They did not create unnatural movements. They simply accelerated or redirected the ones that were already forming. Another invisible mechanism involved leveraging intermediaries who believed they were acting independently. These families rarely took public positions in trade. Instead, they partnered with smaller merchants, lenders, and distributors who unknowingly executed their strategies. When these intermediaries bought aggressively, others followed. When they hesitated, uncertainty spread. The manipulators did not need to dominate markets directly. They only needed to guide the most influential players at the right moment. Because these actions appeared organic, no one suspected that a coordinated force was shaping outcomes behind the scenes. These techniques created a feedback loop of influence. The more effective their interventions became, the more predictable markets appeared to them, and the more chaotic they seemed to everyone else. People blamed nature, war, rulers, or fate for changes that had been carefully engineered. And as the consistency of these hidden patterns grew, the families responsible developed something resembling an early blueprint of economic control, one that would silently evolve into frameworks replicated centuries later, shaping the financial systems we still navigate today. Before we continue, tell me something. Have you ever sensed that a market movement felt too perfectly timed to be accidental? Leave your comment, sharing what it made you think about. As these strategies matured, the families behind them began building networks that reached far beyond simple trade connections. They recognized that influence required stability, and stability required alliances that crossed borders, classes, and political structures. What emerged was a hidden architecture of relationships linking early banks, local rulers, influential merchants, and even religious institutions. Each connection served a purpose. Information flowed more quickly, risks were shared discreetly, and opportunities could be exploited before anyone else recognized them. These networks were not formal organizations with official names. They were webs of loyalty, obligation, and mutually beneficial secrecy. At the core of these networks were individuals who acted as bridges between worlds. A trusted advisor to a ruler might be in direct contact with moneylenders who understood regional shortages. A merchant with ties to foreign ports could relay shipping delays long before they became public knowledge. Even scribes responsible for documenting taxes or harvest projections unwittingly contributed to a reservoir of intelligence valuable to those who knew how to interpret it. These families positioned themselves to receive this information first, processing it in ways that allowed them to predict outcomes with unsettling accuracy. By the time the wider market learned of an issue, they had already adjusted their strategies. The influence of these networks extended into governance. Rulers relied heavily on lenders capable of providing quick funds during wars, diplomatic tensions, or economic downturns. With financial support came leverage, and with leverage came the ability to shape decisions. These families never needed to sit on thrones. They simply needed their advice to be indispensable. Laws concerning trade, taxes, or tariffs often reflected the interests of these hidden influencers rather than the public good. The illusion of independent governance remained intact, but the quiet hand-guiding policy gained strength. This interconnectedness also protected them from threats. When competition emerged, the network provided early warnings or economic pressure. When crises appeared, they pivoted before losses spread. Their resilience convinced many rulers and merchants that these families possessed extraordinary intuition. In reality, it was the power of coordinated information flowing through channels they designed. The system became the backbone of future financial empires, laying the foundation for institutions that would later formalize global economic influence. And as this web expanded, the lines between manipulation, governance, and strategy grew increasingly blurred, setting the stage for the next evolution of hidden financial power, where control no longer depended solely on secrets, but on the sophisticated structures those secrets had helped build. As these networks expanded, the consequences of their actions began to shape economies far beyond the regions where they operated. What appeared to be isolated market shifts were, in truth, ripples created by decisions made within their private circles. Once they controlled the core channels of trade, information, and political leverage, their influence naturally extended into the lives of ordinary people. Villagers who never met a merchant, traders who never traveled beyond their borders, and farmers who relied on local harvests all felt the effects of strategies devised in rooms they would never enter. Economic cycles became less about nature and more about unseen calculations that determined who prospered and who struggled. These families understood that markets were ecosystems. Ecosystems could be shaped by influencing just a few critical variables. A small adjustment in grain supply could determine whether bread was affordable or dangerously scarce. Subtle pressure on lenders could make credit available one season and restrictive the next. By shifting the balance of import and export routes, they dictated what goods became prized luxuries and which ones faded into irrelevance. In many regions, these fluctuations were attributed to fate, divine will, or the unpredictable nature of commerce. Yet behind those stories, patterns existed that traced directly back to calculated decisions. Over time, these patterns became so consistent that they embedded themselves into the fabric of society. People adapted to uncertainty without realizing it was being engineered. Rulers attempted to stabilize their economies, unaware that the very advisors they consulted were part of the same hidden systems causing the instability. Merchants tried to predict market behavior, only to find themselves always a step behind forces they could not see. This sense of unpredictability granted the manipulating families even more power, because they alone operated from a position of clarity. When others hesitated, they acted. When others panicked, they benefited. The impact on common citizens was complex. Some experienced prosperity during strategic booms, while others endured hardship during engineered shortages. Families relocated, trade patterns shifted, and entire communities rose or fell based on factors that did not originate locally. These fluctuations shaped culture, migration, and even the political identity of certain regions. As wealth concentrated silently in the hands of those orchestrating these movements, their influence evolved from mere manipulation into something far more structural. Their decisions no longer shaped markets momentarily. They shaped the trajectory of entire societies. And as their techniques advanced, they created the groundwork for a new era in which financial control would intertwine with geopolitical ambition, setting the stage for the next phase of their expanding dominance. As these hidden strategies became more refined, the families behind them began shaping not just markets, but the evolution of financial systems themselves. Their early experiments with information control, supply manipulation, and psychological influence naturally progressed into more coordinated structures that resembled prototypes of the mechanisms used by later empires. What had once been intuitive practices grew into patterns, and those patterns slowly became frameworks capable of guiding entire economic cycles. These families recognized that influence was most effective when institutionalized, even if the institutions themselves appeared independent. So they encouraged the rise of early banking houses, trade councils, and merchant guilds, all while ensuring their own agents sat quietly at the key points of decision-making. Over time, these methods expanded beyond trade. They learned how to influence currency values by shifting reserves of precious metals at critical moments. They discovered that lending to rulers during conflicts provided leverage far beyond simple repayment. They understood that controlling repayment schedules, interest terms, and emergency credit could reshape political alliances. Even taxation systems became opportunities. By advising rulers on when and how to collect revenue, they nudged economic pressure points that produced predictable reactions in the population. None of this required open involvement. Their strength came from their invisibility, from the illusion that governments acted autonomously when, in reality, many decisions aligned with the interests of those who supplied financial stability. These evolving methods created patterns mirrored centuries later by more famous dynasties. Long before the Carnegies or the Morgans built monumental financial empires, these early families had already tested the underlying concepts: influence through liquidity, stability through selective generosity, and control through dependence. Their techniques would inspire banking systems, central treasury functions, and even early models of international finance. And because their influence operated through advisors, lenders, and intermediaries, their presence could persist through generations without public recognition. They crafted a form of continuity that outlasted political cycles and dynastic changes, embedding themselves into the foundations of economic life. What makes this evolution so striking is how easily it blended into history. Records of prices, wars, and treaties rarely mention the quiet forces guiding them, yet the fingerprints of influence remain visible to anyone who studies the patterns. Once manipulation becomes structured, it also becomes scalable. And as their systems expanded, so did the reach of their power, preparing the way for the financial empires that followed, which would inherit the blueprint without ever acknowledging its origins, continuing a lineage of control that remained hidden in plain sight. Before we advance, tell me something. Which part of this hidden evolution do you think shaped modern finance the most? Leave a comment sharing your perspective. As these frameworks solidified, the hidden systems created by early financial families began to echo unmistakably across eras. When we compare their methods with modern mechanisms, the parallels are astonishing. Their influence networks functioned much like contemporary financial institutions that rely on rapid information flow, predictive modeling, and coordinated strategies disguised as market responses. The psychological manipulation they once employed through rumors and delayed shipments now appears in the form of speculative narratives, strategic press releases, and tactical economic forecasts that sway investor sentiment. Although the tools have changed, the underlying logic remains remarkably consistent: control perception, influence movement, and stay ahead of the reactions you create. Just as those early families leveraged scarcity to guide prices, modern systems manipulate supply through production cuts, interest rate adjustments, and carefully timed announcements. Market participants often believe these shifts are natural consequences of economic cycles. Yet anyone who studies their patterns sees how orchestrated they can be. The same dynamic existed centuries ago. What differs today is the speed at which influence travels. Instead of relying on messengers or seasonal trade routes, financial signals now move instantaneously, amplifying the effect of strategies rooted in principles far older than digital technology. These ancestral techniques also resurfaced in the way contemporary institutions interact with governments. Early families gain leverage by lending during crises, shaping political decisions in the process. Modern entities do the same through bailouts, emergency credit lines, and behind-the-scenes negotiations that determine which industries survive and which collapse. The interdependence between financial power and political authority, once maintained through handwritten agreements and personal alliances, now functions through integrated systems of regulation, global markets, and economic diplomacy. Yet the structure is familiar. Those who control liquidity often control outcomes. Even international finance mirrors these ancient patterns. The selective movement of wealth, once dictated by caravans or naval fleets, has become digital but retains the same strategic intent. Capital flows strategically toward regions, offering leverage, influence, or long-term advantage. Nations compete for investment, much like ancient rulers competed for trade routes, and economic pressure remains a powerful tool for shaping geopolitical landscapes. The shadows of the past are not simply historical curiosities. They are living frameworks embedded in the architecture of the global economy. What becomes increasingly clear is that the financial complexity of the modern world is not the result of spontaneous innovation. It is an expanded version of old ideas, tested across centuries by families who understood that influence is most effective when it feels invisible. Their patterns persist, adapted but unchanged, preparing us to see how the forces we navigate today are rooted in a deeper historical continuity that is rarely acknowledged but impossible to deny once the connections become visible. As the centuries progressed, the continuity between past and present became less a matter of coincidence and more a reflection of a persistent pattern of power. The same invisible logic that guided early market manipulation resurfaced repeatedly, adapted to each era's technology, political structure, and economic landscape. When we examine financial crises, currency collapses, debt cycles, and sudden shifts in global wealth, we often see the same underlying mechanics: concentrated influence, asymmetric access to information, and coordinated strategies operating behind the facade of natural market behavior. These parallels form a thread connecting forgotten families of the past to the most powerful institutions of the modern world. One of the most striking consistencies lies in how crises are used not as setbacks, but as opportunities. Just as early families leveraged shortages and uncertainty to expand their control, modern systems benefit from chaos that weakens competitors and consolidates influence. Economic collapses often redistribute wealth upward, placing more assets under the control of those who entered the crisis with information, liquidity, or strategic positioning. It resembles a cycle rather than a random sequence of events, a rhythm that consistently favors those who understand its hidden timing. This pattern mirrors ancient strategies where disruption was not feared but anticipated, and sometimes quietly encouraged. Another continuity appears in the way dependency is engineered. Early rulers relied on lenders to fund wars or stabilize their kingdoms, creating leverage for the families behind the loans. Today, nations depend on global markets, credit rating agencies, multinational banks, and financial institutions whose decisions influence everything from currency strength to public policy. The language has changed, the scale has expanded, but the structure remains familiar. Those who provide stability acquire influence over those who require it. Throughout history, this imbalance has shaped alliances, wars, reforms, and entire national identities. Even the narrative control exercised by ancient families echoes through the modern world. The spread of rumors evolved into the management of financial news, market, projections, and economic commentary. Public reactions continue to follow predictable psychological patterns that can be influenced with strategic precision. Whether through selective disclosures, expert opinions, or orchestrated warnings, the flow of information remains as powerful as ever. And just like centuries ago, most people perceive these shifts as organic, unaware that the timing and tone often serve deeper purposes. What emerges from these parallels is a sense that we are not simply witnessing new forms of economic manipulation, but rather participating in the latest iteration of a much older system. The invisible threads running through history continue to shape decisions, crises, and market movements in ways that rarely appear accidental when viewed from a broader perspective. And as these patterns persist, they prepare the ground for a revealing final insight, one that ties together the unseen forces of the past with the complex financial structures that govern the present. As these hidden dynamics unfold across centuries, it becomes impossible to ignore the deeper pattern uniting them. At every stage of economic development, from ancient marketplaces to modern financial systems, control has flowed toward those who mastered the invisible levers operating beneath the surface. Early families influenced scarcity and perception through rudimentary methods, while later dynasties refined the same principles into institutional frameworks. Today, these ideas have evolved into global mechanisms so complex that most people assume they emerged naturally. Yet the logic behind them is the same one used generations ago: shape behavior without announcing your presence, guide outcomes without taking visible credit, and allow the system itself to appear spontaneous. This continuity suggests that financial evolution is not a straight line of innovation, but a recurring cycle shaped by minds who understood how to operate quietly while others focused on the visible world. If we look closely at modern events, the connections become even clearer. Crises that seem sudden often follow predictable rhythms that mirror past disruptions. Surges of wealth accumulation trace the same arcs that lifted early families into positions of power. Even the relationship between governments and financial entities reflects an old dependency, where those who control liquidity influence decisions at the highest levels. The present is not separate from the past. It is its extension, layered with new tools, but guided by the same underlying architecture. What changes over time is not the mechanism, but the clarity with which we can see it. The more we understand these patterns, the harder it becomes to accept the idea of randomness in global markets. Recognizing this continuity does not mean assuming a single group controls everything, but rather acknowledging that the system itself was shaped by generations who perfected strategies of influence. Their legacy is embedded in the financial structures we navigate daily. And once you notice the rhythm behind these patterns, you begin to interpret headlines, market swings, and geopolitical shifts differently. You start to see the fingerprints of a long historical cycle repeating in subtle ways that most people overlook. This awareness opens a door to understanding the forces that move wealth, power, and opportunity in the modern world. If this journey through hidden financial history made you see the present with new eyes, feel free to let me know. Leave a comment saying the phrase "I am with you until the end," so I know you arrived here with clarity. And if the value of this deep exploration resonated with you, it would mean a lot if you subscribed to the channel and left a like to help this conversation reach more people who seek real understanding. There is another video here that continues this line of reasoning, expanding the connections we began uncovering. Click on it and keep exploring these patterns with me, because once we start recognizing the invisible architecture behind global finance, every piece begins to make more sense.